Under the dim glow of Los Angeles streetlights, a young girl's life is on the line, but a forgotten man hiding from his past is about to step out of the shadows and change everything. Before we dive in, tell me where you're watching from. I'd love to know. The evening was colder than usual, and the streets of downtown Los Angeles were alive with the hum of city lights. In an alley shrouded in shadows, a desperate struggle was taking place. Emily Holloway, a 16-year-old girl wearing an expensive designer dress, struggled violently against her abductor's grip. Her designer shoes scraped the sidewalk, each step a cry for help. "Shut up, rich girl," the masked man hissed, his breath hot against her ear. The knife in his hand gleamed under the streetlight, cold and sharp as he pressed it against her throat. "You're going to do exactly as I say, or else—" But before the man could finish his threat, a loud crash interrupted him. The trash can nearby toppled over, sending a cascade of food wrappers and refuse across the alley. From the darkness, a figure appeared. He was tall, wearing a tattered coat that flapped in the cold wind, a long beard covering his weathered face. Matt "Rusty" Callahan hadn't had a job in over a decade. He had lived on the streets, sleeping in alleys and dumpsters, long forgotten by society. But his hands, though roughened by time and hardship, still remembered how to fight. "Let her go," Rusty said, his voice low and steady, not a hint of fear in his words. The man spun around, his eyes wide, but before he could react, Rusty was on him. The fight was over almost before it began. Rusty's swift, precise movements were nothing short of deadly. He disarmed the kidnapper, knocked him to the ground, and secured him in seconds. The knife fell, and Emily staggered backward, her breath coming in quick gasps. Rusty turned to her, his face softening for the first time in years. "Are you okay?" he asked. Emily looked up at him, confusion and gratitude mixing in her eyes. She nodded, but before she could say anything, the man on the ground began to stir. Rusty's eyes darkened. This was far from over. Without a word, he turned and disappeared into the shadows, leaving Emily staring after him, still shaken, but safe. The next morning, Rusty woke to the roar of a luxury engine. The sound was jarring against the quiet of his makeshift tent, a stark contrast to the usual hum of the street. As he stirred from sleep, he rubbed his eyes, still disoriented from the night before. The scent of coffee mixed with the metallic scent of the limo's exhaust. A black limo pulled up beside his tent. Its sleek black body glinted in the morning sun, the tinted windows concealing the passenger inside. The driver, an impeccably dressed man, stepped out and approached Rusty. He knocked lightly on the side of the tent. "Mr. Callahan?" the driver asked politely. "Mr. Holloway requests your presence." Rusty froze, his heart pounding. He hadn't heard that name in years. The name of the man who had once been his mentor and the man who had ruined his life. He followed the driver to the limo, reluctant yet curious. Inside, the atmosphere was unnervingly quiet, with only the sound of the limo's engine purring beneath them. The driver handed Rusty a tablet, its screen displaying security footage from the night before. Rusty's eyes widened as the video showed him, disarming the kidnapper with military precision, before vanishing into the night like a ghost. It was as though someone had been watching him all along. The voice that crackled through the speaker wasn't unfamiliar. It was Charles Holloway's voice. "You were the best operative I ever trained, Matt," the voice said, "and you've been hiding from me for a decade." Rusty's hands clenched into fists. "I never wanted this," he muttered under his breath. The screen switched to a live feed showing Charles Holloway himself, staring directly into the camera, his expression as cold and calculating as Rusty remembered. "Time to come home, Agent Callahan," Charles said, his voice smooth like he was speaking to an old friend. Rusty's mind reeled. Charles Holloway, the tech mogul and former CIA director, had found him. But what did he want now? Matt "Rusty" Callahan wiped blood from his knife, his mind numb as he stared down at the motionless body. His heart raced, but his training kicked in. He was a CIA operative. His job was to get in, get out, and ensure that the mission was completed. But this mission had been different. It had been Charles who had called the shots, and Rusty had followed orders. The mission had been simple: extract a politician's daughter and make sure she was safe. It should have been a routine job. But then, everything went wrong. He had stood there in the safe house, his knife still slick with blood, while Charles clapped him on the back. "Perfect extraction. The senator's daughter is safe because of you," Charles had said. But there was no victory in Rusty's heart. Charles's eyes had gleamed with pride, but Rusty had known something darker was at play. He had refused to kill an innocent target, and that had been his mistake. He remembered the gunfire, the sharp, ringing sound that followed, the feeling of betrayal when Charles ordered the erasure of his cover identity, the silence as he became a ghost. The ghost had lasted for years. The man he once was had died that day, replaced by the homeless wanderer who now stood in front of Charles Holloway. "Matt," Charles's voice on the tablet pulled him back to the present. "I've been keeping an eye on you. You think you can run from the CIA from me, but you can't hide forever. You know that, don't you?" Rusty's hands shook, but this time, they weren't shaking from fear. They were shaking with anger. "You ruined my life," Rusty spat, his voice low and dangerous. "And now, you're dragging me back into your mess. I'm done being your pawn." Holloway Tower loomed like a glass dagger, its sharp edges gleaming in the light. Inside the building, Rusty was led to the penthouse by the same driver. Emily was already waiting for him, a warm smile on her face as she approached him. "This is the man who saved me," she beamed, her voice full of admiration. Rusty couldn't bring himself to smile back. Emily had no idea what her father had done, what her father had made him into. She didn't know the truth about how her father had used her as bait. Charles Holloway, standing beside his daughter, gave a polite nod, but his eyes were cold, calculating. "Oh, I know exactly who he is," Charles said smoothly, his gaze unwavering. The moment felt suffocating. Rusty was standing in the lion's den, but it was time for the truth to come out. Emily gasped as her father pressed a button on the wall. The windows darkened and a row of monitors appeared, showing security footage from the night before. On the screens were details of Rusty's CIA service records, his fake death certificate, and then a live feed of the real kidnapper strapped to a chair in some dark, abandoned room. "Charles," Rusty breathed, the realization sinking in. "You set this up. You used your daughter to draw me back into this." Charles sipped his whiskey and didn't even flinch. "I needed to flush out the one man who could expose Project Phoenix, and my daughter made perfect bait." Emily's face went white. "Dad!" She couldn't believe what she was hearing. The shock was evident in her voice. Rusty moved faster than anyone could react. One moment, he was standing still. The next, he had disarmed two guards, his hand around the letter opener, and Charles was at his mercy. "Matt, wait!" Emily screamed. But it was too late. Rusty wasn't going to let this man go again. The man who had destroyed his life, who had manipulated everyone around him. This time, Charles was going down. Suddenly, the penthouse doors burst open. Tactical agents swarmed in, flooding the room in an instant. Rusty made eye contact with one of them, a man he once called his partner. The man gave a subtle nod, and Rusty knew what it meant. But before he could make his move, everything went black. The last thing he heard before losing consciousness was the soft whisper of his old partner's voice. "We've got this, Matt. Stay with us." Rusty's final thought as he was dragged away, "She's still in danger." The world slowly came back to Rusty Callahan in waves of pain. the kind of pain that felt too familiar, like an old friend he couldn't shake. He blinked his eyes open, but the light that poured into the room was blinding. His head pounded, and his arms were sore from being shackled to a cold metal table. He was disoriented, confused, yet deep down he already knew where he was. He could smell the sterile antiseptic mingling with the faint scent of fear. The CIA's black site, the last place he'd ever want to be. He tried to shift his weight, but his arms were locked in place, and his legs felt heavy, like they'd been asleep for far too long. His entire body felt like a bruise, hard, aching, and broken. Then the door creaked open. Rusty barely registered the figure that stepped inside. His vision was blurry, but the voice was unmistakable. "You look like hell, Callahan." It was Agent Daniel Shaw, his old partner. Rusty hadn't seen Shaw in years, too many years. He never expected to see him again under these circumstances. Shaw leaned against the wall, his arms folded, and tossed a set of dog tags onto the table with a clatter. Rusty's gaze followed the tags, his old ones, the ones he'd buried with his fake identity 10 years ago, the ones he'd discarded when he'd disappeared into the shadows, living a life no one knew about. Rusty lifted his head weakly and chuckled. "Funny. I don't remember dying." Shaw's face remained cold, his eyes narrowed with a look of almost pity. "Charles wants you to think you're dead again, but Emily, she's asking questions." Rusty's heart sank. The mention of Emily sent a jolt through his body. His mind raced back to the night before, when he had watched her from afar, his chest tightening at the thought of her. The beautiful, bright-eyed daughter of the man who had destroyed him, who had used her as bait. She was smart, too smart for her own good. And now it seemed she was digging into her father's secrets. Shaw flicked a switch, and the monitors in the room buzzed to life. The first screen showed Emily at her computer, hacking into her father's private servers. Rusty's heart skipped a beat as the files on the screen flickered. Project Phoenix, his worst nightmare. The next image was more troubling. A live feed showing Charles Holloway sitting across from the supposed kidnapper, the very man Rusty had fought the night before. The man was alive, well, and sitting comfortably in a dark room smirking at the camera. Rusty felt his throat tighten. Emily was involved. She was turning against her father, digging into the truth. This was the moment he'd feared. She was no longer just a pawn. She was a threat to everything Charles had built. "She's turning against him, Shaw," Rusty muttered under his breath. "She's figuring it all out." Shaw's eyes darkened. "And that's why you're here, Matt. Charles wants you to take care of it. He wants you to come back. He wants you to fix this before she brings it all down." Emily Holloway sat alone in her room, her fingers trembling as they moved across the keyboard. She had already cracked through several layers of encryption, and each click brought her deeper into her father's secrets. The documents she found, the ones under the label Project Phoenix, burned into her mind like a scar. She stared at the screen, unable to tear her eyes away from the atrocities she was reading about. Child trafficking disguised as adoptions, assassinations of journalists who came too close to the truth. These were the actions of the man she had called father. Her heart beat wildly in her chest, a cold knot forming in her stomach. How could he? How could the man she had trusted, the man who had raised her, be capable of something so vile? The next document flashed on her screen, a report about her own kidnapping. She scrolled down in disbelief. It was all planned. Her father had orchestrated it just to bring Rusty back into the fold, to activate the man who could protect him from the truth being exposed. The family portrait on her desk cracked with a loud pop as it slammed against the wall. Emily let out a cry of frustration, throwing her hands into her hair. This wasn't a test. It was manipulation. Her entire life had been a lie. Her phone buzzed suddenly, breaking her from her thoughts. She picked it up, seeing an unknown number flashing on the screen. Without hesitation, she answered. "Storage Unit 317. Key under your mother's rose bush." A friend. Emily felt the ground shift beneath her feet. Her heart pounded in her chest. The message was cryptic, but the urgency in the words felt like a lifeline. She had to know more. She had to find the truth. Her truth. Rusty's mind raced. He had been in tight spots before, but this was different. The man who had ruined his life, Charles Holloway, had forced his hand. He was a prisoner again, but not for long. Shaw had told him that they were shipping him to Dubai that night, but Rusty wasn't about to let that happen. He wasn't going back into the shadows. Not without Emily. Not without putting an end to this once and for all. Shaw had slipped a pistol under the table. It was the same kind of weapon they'd used in Berlin all those years ago. Rusty took a deep breath, readying himself for the next move. The plan was simple. Get out of here, grab the girl and burn the whole operation down. But first, he needed to get out of this cell. The alarm suddenly screamed in the distance. Rusty's heart thudded against his ribs. Shaw glanced at him. "Ready?" Rusty didn't answer. His eyes locked onto the cuffs around his wrists. With a sudden snap of his wrist, he used a trick Shaw had taught him years ago. He broke free of the restraints. In the same instant, he disarmed 2 guards who had rushed into the room. One guard was on the ground before he even realized it, his taser sent into another guard's chest. The last man didn't even have time to draw his weapon before Rusty knocked him out cold. He grabbed the janitor's uniform from a nearby closet, changing quickly, and walked out the front door. But as he turned the corner, he heard a voice, familiar and frantic. "Wait!" Rusty stopped dead in his tracks. In the pouring rain, standing in front of him, was Emily, clutching a USB drive tightly in her hand. Her face was drenched, her eyes wide with fear and determination. "I know everything now," Emily said, her voice hoarse. "I know what my father did, and I'm done. Help me burn it all down." The sound of a distant explosion filled the air. Rusty's heart skipped a beat. Behind her, Holloway Tower was erupting in flames. The explosion came from the penthouse. Emily had made her choice. She was no longer a pawn in her father's game. Rusty reached for her hand. "Let's end this." The world watched in silence as Charles Holloway stood before the congressional hearing, his smirk finally gone, replaced by the cold realization that he was no longer in control. The sentence was handed down swiftly. 47 life terms for his role in Project Phoenix, for the lives destroyed, for the children trafficked, and for the countless murders he had orchestrated. His empire, built on lies and manipulation, was crumbling before his very eyes. Emily stood beside the podium, her gaze steely as she spoke to the crowd. She had made it clear. She would no longer hide behind her father's shadow. She had donated every last bit of her inheritance to the victims of Project Phoenix, to the families that had lost children to the system her father had built. Rusty stood quietly at the back of the room, ready to disappear again, ready to fade into the background where he belonged. But Emily was different now. She had found her voice, and she wasn't done. The reporters swarmed, their cameras flashing, but Rusty only saw Emily. She walked up to him through the crowd and pressed something into his palm. His dog tags, new ones. The engraving was simple. Matthew Callahan, not forgotten. She leaned in, her voice low but steady. "You didn't have to come back, but you did." Rusty looked down at the tags, his fingers tightening around them. His throat tightened, not from the weight of the past, but from the quiet hope of what might still come. He didn't know what they were to each other yet. Maybe they never would. But in that moment, standing side by side as the world tried to make sense of the fire behind them, one thing was clear. They weren't alone anymore. Subscribe and follow for more thrilling stories.